dystopian fiction has been moved to current affairs.
Hello, my droogs, and welcome to another horror show edition of our Poddywod. Dystopian fiction has been moved to current affairs. So grab yourself a tass of the old milky chai and slooshy us govereat about A Clockwork Orange.
Um, so today we're talking about A Clockwork Orange, and it's a novel by Anthony Burgess and was adapted by, I think we're mostly focusing on the film by Stanley
Yeah.
Kubrick. So the story, sort of to give a synopsis, is set in a futuristic sort of violent society following our protagonist Alex, who's this teenager he's big fan of classical music and violence. And he sort of just like leads a gang of like other young delinquents and commits like various crimes and such, but eventually gets caught. And so he's arrested and then given the opportunity to undergo this experimental rehabilitation procedure called the Ludovico technique, I think.
I think so.
That's what it's called. So if anyone's familiar with Pavlov's dogs, that's an example of classical conditioning where a response to a certain stimulus is paired with another neutral stimulus. So, for example, the reaction of dogs salivating to the sound of a bell came from them hearing that bell neutral stimulus at the same time as being exposed to the smell of, food that causes them to salivate. Whilst operant conditioning is more along the lines of positive and negative reinforcement. So this treatment, this Ludovico technique, is it Ludovico?
I think we could definitely use both.
Okay.
I think they say Ludovico in the film, but I might be
Ludovico.
wrong about
Okay.
that. But it looks certainly very
Okay.
Italian, doesn't it?
Yeah, the Ludovico technique basically conditions our character against violence by associating it with feelings of intense nausea. And this has a number of ethical implications of government control and the sort of central theme of free will. Bit of like human nature, I'd say. So I think we're gonna sort of dive into that a bit more.
Because this is a multi-layered dystopian world, really, isn't it? And I think that's something that we're obviously going to talk about, the ethics and the sort of plausibility of that form of rehabilitation. But it's not to say that the system is bad and the world outside is better, because actually it's the world outside that is already dystopian in many ways. And it's interesting because you mentioned that it's like futuristic, but of course it's futuristic for 1962 or the 1970s when the film was made. It's aesthetically, has a lot of that sort of 70s futurism to it, doesn't it?
Yes, sure.
But it's a world in which people basically don't feel safe to go outside at night. They're not safe answering their doors, and the kind of reason for that is that people like Alex and his droogs are out there doing ultraviolence, as he puts it, essentially for its own sake, for their own entertainment. I mean, obviously, sort of stealing for money and things like that, but much more than that. Just taking pleasure in the violence itself. And there's a bit early in the film where there's a drunken tramp who is singing in an underpass, and they beat him up. Before they do that, he kind of basically says he doesn't want to live in this world because he says it's a stinking world because there's no law and order anymore. It's a stinking world because it lets the young get on to the old like you done. It's no world for an old man anymore. So we know that this is a world where everything is kind of collapsed. And within that, we have these young men who, I suppose, what we were sort of thinking about was this idea that we don't know why. I suppose, why do they do the things that they do? So yeah, I don't know, what are your thoughts about that side of things?
I mean, we were discussing how this sort of interpretation of violence and youth and sort of understanding why it happens completely ignores the idea that crime is a product of social issues. Because we get a bit of a look at Alex's general home life. I would say seems to have parents who whilst they may not seem to be the most present, would you say?
Yeah.
Still engage with him, and he has a very comfortable home life, a room to himself. He has even a pet snake and a number of, things going for him. He's in school and stuff, although in and out of school is what sort of
in reform school and not going to that very often by the look of things.
Which is it's I mean, Alex's kind of character as a whole it's because he's obviously this sort of violent and criminal character, but at the same time he has that sort of classic intelligence, and as he's quite witty and charismatic, which again he kind of uses in his favor in various ways. But I don't know,
I think that that gives us another sort of level when we're talking about sort of these ideas of sort of what the circumstances are in which he's kind of come to be as he is, because he is in his way an authoritarian figure within his gang. When they try to have their own thoughts about what they should do, he basically shoves them in the water and stabs Dim in the hand and so on. So there's and the very fact that Dim is called Dim and is belittled so much and so on is again a sign of this weird hierarchy that they've got going on. But you're right, I think it's not as though his parents don't work. I mean, interestingly, in the book, there's a mention of the fact that it's obligatory to work. So there's like a societal, sort of like a planned economy where people are put into jobs made to do them. That's not necessarily apparent in the film because there's not quite so much background, but certainly there's a culture of work with his parents, isn't there? And as you say, yes, he has his own room. He's well fed. He's got the structure provided by a system that is trying to stop him growing up into a criminal. So maybe one of the things that it's trying to do is sort of say, well, I think it is trying to say, let's not pander to this sort of liberal view that criminals are all a victim of their circumstances. Some people just enjoy being
I guess
bad.
There's this sort of, like sort of ultimate evil, like sort of internal evil that you can't really change in someone.
I mean, there's quite a lot of religious stuff in the book and the film, and there's been quite a lot of written about this in terms of sort of the different theologies behind it. But certainly there's quite a strong sense, I think, of the good and the evil as two things that are black and white. And Alex basically saying, I was glad to be on the side of the devil, essentially. That was like he'd chosen that. He uses various bits of language, not necessarily quite that explicit, but that say that. So there's an idea that it's a choice that he's made, or that he doesn't see kind of the consequences of his actions until he's actually caught. But there's also, I mean, I suppose if we were to say, take the flip side and argue that, there is something here about the society in which he lives. He's not a unique sort of psychopath. It's sort of suggesting that there's almost like a psychopathic generation here.
Yeah, a bit of like a, epidemic or something.
Yeah. And particularly among like the young, this idea that young people essentially kind of go through a phase of this, of sort of sort of rebelling against society, or of complete like selfishness, which again is not really a narrative that I'm very comfortable with, but I think it is one that Burgess is trying to put across. I mean, one of the things that we were talking about is the fact that in the film, obviously we've got characters who are played by men in their 20s. Classic sort of teenagers played by older actors, and so it adds to that shock value when he says and I've got to get up for school in the morning or whatever. But in the book specifically, we're told that he is only 15 when all of this happens, and that the other droogs are maybe a little bit older, but essentially these are all people of school age, and that is way more troubling when we start to sort of view that. What about the sort of drugs and alcohol elements. How do you think that plays into kind of their behavior?
I mean, so they're depicted sort of frequenting this weird milk bar, which I don't know what that's meant to really be a metaphor for. Is that
so? I'm sure. I mean, there's a reference to Moloko Plus, which is basically that. I think the idea is you didn't have to have a license to sell milk with drugs in.
Right. Okay. Okay.
In the book, they drink alcohol in pubs as well, but that's obviously a real aesthetic focus of the film. It's on the milk bar. That's obviously their home. And I don't know whether, I mean, it sort of plays on that idea of like milk is something that's drunk by children.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you've turned it into like an adult drink, and it sort of fires them up for the ultraviolence and so on. So
and also kind of a very like inherently, especially in the aesthetics of the film, like an inherently sexual thing.
Yeah.
Like even the way that it's poured from like this statue of a woman's breast is like suddenly become quite weird and sexual.
Yeah, the sexual imagery, I think. I mean, there's a lot of reference to the old in out as it's in the book, but in the film, yeah, I think that aesthetic is really developed, so that this is a very evidently sexualized society.
Very quite provocative. Yeah,
it's a very strong misogynistic element to the sort of like the women's bodies being used as tables and things like that. So but not only frequented by men, and not only frequented by the NADSAT generation either in the film, so because there's like professionals there as well. So not clear whether that in itself is supposed to say that this is not really countercultural, this is quite normalized, which would say that there is a whole societal factor here if you've got places that create this kind of sort of environment in which young people can go out and thrive. There's also something, I think, about the parole officer, particularly in the film. Is again very strong similarities in the film, the book, but the aesthetic again of that scene when his what I say his name was Deltoid, I think.
Yes.
Deltoid comes round to his house to check on him, which sort of suggests to us, there's some sort of system in place to try and stop young offenders from reoffending and so on. But that characterization of him really undermines that.
Yes. Again, there's that kind of, so he's kind of talking about talking to Alex about him not getting into trouble, and he's sort of hinting at the fact that he knows about what sort of activities Alex gets up to in his spare time, and then he just ends up groping him at the end. It's just again that sort of hyper weird sexualization, but also reflects that even the adults and people who are meant to be these forces of kind of order are also abusing this sort of culture of like hypersexualization and a sort of this sort of world of sexual violence. And sexual violence. Because I don't know. It's really weird just because I don't know how much the book does it, but it's almost like, I think let me just find this little quotation. Yeah, I think there was a New Yorker review of the film titled Stanley Strange Love by Pauline Kael, and called it pornographic because of how it dehumanized Alex's victims whilst highlighting the suffering of like the protagonist himself. Because it does really sort of play up on like the sort of notes of sympathy as the story goes on from initial I don't know, but especially with that parole officer, it's kind of like Alex is not to the same extent that he causes his own victims harm, but also is sort of predated by culture.
I completely agree with you there. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about Anthony Burgess talking about this when he wrote an essay sort of really challenging, I guess, the popularity of the book that he somewhat rejected later in his career. But he talks about this idea that he as a writer, and he thinks that writers take a sort of vicarious pleasure in the violent actions of the characters that they write. So basically saying, while he would not either have the moral character or perhaps the bravery to go out and do the sorts of things that Alex does, he takes a sort of perverted pleasure in writing Alex doing them. So almost suggesting that he believes that kind of this is in everybody's nature, Whether this is a man thing particularly is unclear, because women are consistently victims in the text. But like, everybody wants to do this. It's just that society doesn't permit us to do it, and it's only when those sort of mores break down that everyone will go and behave that way. So yeah, I mean, there is a whole social sort of situation here, I think, where, as you say, you've got this parole officer who seems to abuse his power. We've got police, which we'll come on to in a minute, who have a whole set of other issues going on, but a society in which Alex and his friends can access drugs that clearly enhance their appetite for violence. Parents who, although he's in this good home, are basically completely unaware of what it is he gets up to. So the sort of, the nonchalance or the general desire not to pay attention to his behavior seems to play in as well, but almost like a sort of any systems that are in place are so lax, also based around kind of personal power rather than actually doing good. All of that might sort of play in. And of course, Alex also doesn't see himself as being bad per se, in comparison with other criminals. And he talks quite a bit about, meeting leering criminals and perverts ready to dribble all over a luscious young Malchick like your storyteller. So again, what you were saying about kind of his victimization is definitely a big part of the narrative. How much of a problem do you think it is that we get that essentially we gain sympathy for Alex whilst not spending any time over his victims? And indeed, F. Alexander, the only victim we really do encounter again, is not an appealing character himself.
I think it is a little bit problematic over the fact that we do gain sympathy for this outright very unlikable character, but I guess that's a product of the story being from his perspective, and especially I think it leans into that satire of the sort of self-indulgent, like, criminal youth, even the way that he describes himself as like luscious. It's just, yeah, I mean, I don't know, I also, I guess, sort of speaks more towards, like, further towards like the human condition of like how we really only think about like the sympathy to those we feel closest to, whilst like the sort of faceless victims of crimes aren't really considered. I mean, because we follow Alex along his story through his perspective, and whilst I think he does suffer quite a lot, as we'll sort of get into the Ludovico technique further on, I don't know, I find it personally a little bit problematic, but I guess again, the story is a focus on him, and like, rather than the victims and their story, I guess that's just a sort of separate narrative that should be told still. But I don't know, I mean
I think that Burgess probably did mean that to be problematic, and in a way I think that, having just reread the book and rewatch the film, I do think that although the same victim kind of card and perspective is the same through both of them, they've both got the same first person narrative, they're very, very close to one another. There is something about the film which actually slightly lessens, I think, some of his crimes. Some of it's omitted just because of the brevity of the film and so on. So I wonder whether actually it's, if we took the whole picture into account, then as Burgess wrote it, then perhaps it's he's even worse. But I also think, to sort of flip that all on its head, that one of the things that I feel quite strongly about, and we'll come on to sort of prisons in a minute, but is this idea that just because somebody has committed a crime does not mean that they can be subjected to sort of any behaviours as a consequence. It doesn't alleviate all of their rights. It doesn't stop them from being a potential victim themselves.
Yes. Yeah.
So yes, it's really important that we remember the voices of the victims of Alex and others, which I think are omitted, but actually to focus on the one that we perhaps feel less comfortable with and what is done to him actually is quite a bold move. So obviously one of the things that happens is that we have a state in which the police are firstly ineffectual I think, but secondly, downright corrupt as well. So, I mean, what impression did you get of kind of policing from the film?
I think the police at the beginning of the film sort of act in the way that they do in our society. I think their main role in the first half is basically sort of come along and arrest Alex at the call of the woman who he next targets.
So yes, so in that sense, they, if you call the police, as the cat lady does,
the cat lady,
I mean, it's too late for her, but nonetheless, they do respond in that way.
But I think, oh yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say, but that said, let's think about everything that Alex has done prior to this, to which there wasn't a police response.
That's true. Which I guess, however, is like a reflection on their sort of same almost uselessness or inability to create order. But I guess there's so much, like, I don't know how much the police can do without the sort of knowledge. Like a lot of the places that Alex and his droogs sort of visit are quite secluded and without the, because otherwise, if would you be living in a police state if they had eyes and ears everywhere at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's something balanced there between of wanting more community policing and not wanting surveillance on every corner.
Although, however, the sort of issues like come in when so the author, I believe what's his name?
F. Alexander.
See
the nice balancing of names there between Alex and Alexander. Scholars have written about that.
But yes, F. Alexander talks about how the state has begun to employ sort of, what does he say, like young barbarians or something?
Recruiting brutal young roughs into the police, proposing debilitation and will-sapping techniques of conditioning. Yeah, absolutely.
Which I think the big twist is when Alex is sort of wandering these streets alone after he is released from his treatment and discovers that his old gang of delinquents has become part of the police force, which they subsequently abuse this power in the same way that they did. In the same way they abused their power as like a young gang. So there's this sort of implication of where can you really trust the police?
No, which I think has massive ramifications when we're looking at all of the investigations at the moment in the UK into police conduct and so on. This idea that the police force might attract a certain type of person, perhaps particularly a certain type of young man, who then has power that can be wielded both in the course of their job and also to allow them, we've got huge warning signs that were missed in the Sarah Everard case, for example, and the general kind of, I suppose, follow up to that, recognizing the kind of police abuse of powers, particularly sexual abuse, but obviously the sort of taking the law into their own hands that they do with Alex in the film as well. One of the things that happens is when Alex is taken into custody and the way that he is treated there, which again, I think there's plenty of old kind of police dramas and so on that show exactly that sort of behaviour. So that perhaps it's of its time a little bit, but down to the point at which he's spat on by his parole officer. It's really dehumanising in a way that doesn't seem in any way beneficial to their case. Although Alex, of course, is busy pleading that it wasn't him, it was the treachery of his friends who led him astray and so on. So I suppose he's not quite telling the truth there. One of the things that I think that happens to Alex is that he does get overall kind of manipulated by the state. And you've mentioned that, that happens both in prison and also after he is released. I just had one thought about the sort of the context of his release before we get onto the sort of penal system itself, which is that I think that this is a really big problem, which is that, okay, he's supposed to be cured and so on, but have we got there a narrative overall of the release of offenders into society in such a way that they actually end up either becoming victims themselves or, of course, reoffending because of the situation in which they find themselves. When Alex is let out of prison, he goes back to his P&M in their home, only to find they've effectively replaced
him. which is just so he therefore has no parents to take him in because they literally have no lodgings for him, so he's both homeless and jobless and qualificationless because he didn't ever really finish school. Ultimately he is still upstream from a path back into crime, just simply from the situational, the circumstances that he's put in.
Absolutely. And
gone out of his prison.
I think that was something that really struck me, that I think this is a really huge issue, that we don't properly prepare prisoners for reintegration into society through things like homes and jobs and so on. And that's partly because of a severely underfunded probation service, but I think there's lots of other elements to it as well. But then there's also the victimization element, which is, I think, leads us quite nicely into this sort of question about the penal system, because I feel quite strongly that we are not very good at accepting that time has been served, punishment has been done, and that it shouldn't allow a person to continue to be victimized in society based on a crime that they've committed in the past. So the idea of how difficult it is for ex-convicts to find work, for example, the idea of the quite an invasive system that can find out about past crimes. The internet really hasn't helped about this because, of course, newspapers are there forever, and certainly certain crimes really being like they're completely unforgivable. Now, again, maybe this is me being kind of a wishy-washy liberal lefty, but it seems to me that Alex, in a way, whether he was cured or whether he'd served his time, deserved to be protected from two things, actually. One was the fact that he's thinking about taking his own life. And then secondly, from being attacked by a bunch of old people with hitting him and things like that. I don't know. I mean, other people might think otherwise, that this, ultimately he got a 14-year sentence, which is not very long for his crimes, although he's also a 15-year-old. I mean, this is another problem that I think, this idea.
So young. Also, as a 15-year-old, why is he being put in a prison with adults that are literally he describes are preying on him? That's a bit of an issue, probably.
It is. That at least I think wouldn't be the case. Although I don't know. I think he's told this is your final chance, and the next time you'll be tried as an adult or whatever. It feels a bit more plausible in the film because he seems that little bit older. Sure. But you're right. If he is a child, there's a whole other element here. And I think that one of the things that Burgess seems not to agree with is this idea that children are, I don't know, they remain children and should be treated as such and have a level of kind of innocence or whatever. That seems to be completely stripped. One of the things I think I mentioned to you was the fact that he, in the book, they explicitly say that both the other gang and the woman that they're attacking, who is a grown woman in the film, she's supposed to be 10 years old in the book. And likewise, I don't know what you thought, and we'll come on to sort of sex later on, I'm sure, but when Alex takes the two women back from the record store where they've been sucking on their phallic lollies and then he invites them home, how consensual did you think that scene was? The sort of the high speed.
I'm not sure. It was a very long scene of just like high speed, very sped up, just like
clothes on, clothes off, one woman, two women up there.
exactly. I mean, it was the most obviously consensual sex scene throughout the movie. I mean, ultimately, I don't. I mean, there was a lot of sort of the women eventually putting their clothes back on, and then there they go again.
Yeah, exactly. But it doesn't seem like it was supposed to be played as a rape scene. No, whereas in the book, he definitely gets the girls drunk or high or whatever, and then he rapes them, and that and treats it as like, oh, they were bunking off school, so this was part of their education. So these bits about the book where there is this just extra levels that make him seem so much worse.
I mean, it's interesting to see how, only having seen the film, I thought that was already extremely provocative, and even with its like critical reception, I think it got banned in a number of places. Like the book still goes further, that I'd say, like from the more you sort of explain about what happens, but I guess there's sort of a bit of disparity between having that extra visual sort of way of storytelling in a film. I don't know.
Think that what is sort of told in a book which is essentially, it's non-explicit in the book. So it's not, there aren't explicit sexual scenes per se. In the film, there are obviously more explicit sexual scenes, and therefore I suppose it has real risks of veering into the pornographic, and how far does that want to go. And actually Kubrick obviously adopts this very strong sort of sexualized aesthetic, but I don't think there's any gratuitous sexual violence on screen. There's a lot of implied sexual violence and so on. So when that scene is played out, it's much more just about kind of, I suppose, showing the part of sex, the role of sex, and with two women at once, and repeated sex over the course of an afternoon of this boy who's supposed to be in school. I suppose that's kind of what it achieves. This whole theme of sort of sex in the film, particularly where it's so omnipresent, what do you think it was trying to say about sex in that society, and it's like what it means for Alex?
I mean, I think there's a bit of like, it treats it as a bit of a commodity. It doesn't have the same connotations of like closeness and committal. I'd say there is still more. I mean, I think like in our modern society, there is a bit more of, I guess, a widespread hookup culture, which I think both has its like benefits and drawbacks. Whilst I think in the real world, I think that brings an open and more comfortable and sort of relaxed conversation about sex. I think that it has its pros and cons, but here I think it's not really shown as, I guess that's the sort of character that like Alex is, but it's very sort of self-indulgent, more focused on your own pleasure sort of sense. I think what is sort of my assessment of it.
I mean, one of the things that I think it does is it's for me create quite a negative, like a negative view of sex. Either if we take the two girls from the record store, you talk about kind of hookup culture and so on, it sort of has a negative view of that because it becomes part of Alex's world, and therefore
it becomes
negative.
more of his, like,
and
his,
it becomes related
fantasies,
it becomes related to his attitude to rape. So this idea that that's how he has lots of, and even the language, we haven't really talked much about Nadsat, but calling it the old in out is really
it just brings it down to its like fundamental, just like mechanics.
But then I thought as well, there are other places in the film where I found it quite hard to decide exactly what they were doing with the kind of erotic imagery. So we talked about the milk bar, and I think there, it sort of creates into this sort of society where misogyny is rife and so on. But in the cat lady's house, and this is unique to the film, there's obviously all that sexual art everywhere, erotic art everywhere. And why did Kubrick do that, do you think? Or what do you think it added to that scene? She wasn't just a woman in a house full of cats. She was a woman doing sexy yoga and then having, pictures of vulvas and that enormous
and that weird
sort of dick statue on the side.
I guess that is reflective of, because it's meant to be this futuristic society. Maybe Kubrick's sort of a prediction of how sex was going to be treated.
So kind of like post the 60s, it's now getting
post
sort
the 60s, it's like, so everyone's like more like open about
free love, becoming more and more free. One of the things that I think was really effective was obviously that in that scene, the major crime for which Alex is actually caught and convicted is what he believes is the accidental killing of a woman, but is in fact basically that he smashed her in the mouth with this giant phallic statue. And it's, as I say, in the book, it's not a penis statue. It's just I think it's a silver statue of a girl or something. I don't know. But obviously, it like concatenates sort of rape and murder into sort of one act by putting the sort of the phallic imagery in there. And of course, it makes it more of a misogynistic act, I think, in the way that it's portrayed. But I just wondered whether, I don't know, there's something very uncomfortable about this way in which sex is reduced to something bad throughout the film, to the extent that when we get onto the Ludovico technique, do you think Alex can have sex at all after that?
Oh, no, not at all. In terms of it being reduced to a completely bad thing, they stop him from being able to commit any sexual acts whatsoever, whether it was consensual, whether it was not so. Which
So
again,
it's a bit like what, like neutering rapists, or rendering them impotent, permanently castrating people, which then takes us into a whole other area that and this felt very, very current to me, because we've talked before about the rise in widespread use of pornography among young people, and particularly the fact that young men are so universally sort of bombarded with it from a really young age. And I think it's I've got the stats somewhere we used before, but like, is it most 13-year-old boys have watched porn, and the fact that then their first sexual encounters tend to be based on what they've seen in porn films, and in many more cases of sort of strangulation of sexual partners and things like that, because they think that that's desirable for everyone. And I wondered if this, the world of A Clockwork Orange kind of perhaps reflects that idea, that one of the things that happens in a more openly sexual culture is that there's more exposure to sexual imagery, and certainly in the instance of porn, that sexual imagery is not well regulated. So what sort of sex you're seeing can be very narrow and potentially violent sex and so on. So I just thought that was a really interesting thing. I mean, the aesthetic is very powerful, but I also wondered whether it's made a very negative view of sex generally. One of the things that doesn't get focused on really very much is the fact, it's the idea of sort of sexual abuse in prisons. I mean, it's alluded to, but it's not a big thing, other than, that he's being hit on by these leering. And it is disgusting. So when he's in chapel and he's sitting up the front doing his little turning of the hymn thing, and he's being leered at by...
he's getting leered at and winked at and sort of,
So that's alluded to, but there's a slightly less emphasis, I think, than perhaps... Maybe there's more in the book, but... there doesn't seem to be as much emphasis on sort of violence within prisons as perhaps you'd expect to see. He talks about it. What was that quotation that we had? It had not been edifying, indeed not being in this hellhole and human zoo for 2 years now, being kicked and toll-chopped by brutal warders. So again, this sort of brings us into this question about suitability of prisons and things like that. And, not to talk too much about the differences in the book, but I do think there's a really, really vital difference, which is that, again, it's referenced in the film that they're worried about prison overcrowding. They haven't got anywhere to put people. And so this technique is a way of fixing them so that they've got fewer people in prisons. In the book, they're in a cell for 4, I think, and a 5th man is put in the cell. So there's no bunk. So he's expected to basically share with somebody who's already in this cell. And basically he tries to share with Alex. And there is it's not an explicit sexual assault on Alex, but there's, something goes on there. And anyway, as a consequence, the other cellmates beat this guy up and Alex kills him. Beats him, kicks him to death. And that is really the reason that he gets chosen to have the technique done to him. Not just because he sort of, spoke up in the courtyard or whatever.
I feel like there's in the film, it's more of his own sort of social skills, and he sort of sweet talks this priest that is like a preacher in this prison about, and he kind of uses, I think there's quite a big emphasis on how he manipulates the people around him and sort of plays up to his ultimate evil nature, maybe.
I think that's an important part of it, but I think that there's a much more violent turning point in the book, which also really reinforces again this problem with the prison system. This idea that ultimately this idea that you just keep packing people into prisons and there's no room for them, and that leads us on, I think, really nicely to this big question, which is why do we put people into prisons? What is the penal system for? And there's quite a lot of discussion about this, both from the Minister of the Interior and also the governor, with their different views on kind of what prison is for. And certainly this idea that basically the minister is common criminals should just be cured, and that's Ludovico technique is obviously playing into that. Punishment means nothing to them. They enjoy their so-called punishment, and the governor is basically an eye for an eye. If someone hits you, you hit back. Why then should not the state very severely hit back by you brutal offenders not hit back also? But the new view is to say no. The new view is that we turn the bad into good, all of which seems to be grossly unjust. So there's a whole conversation. Why do we send people to prison?
I mean, I'm not even sure whether to go. I was going to mention for the eye for an eye sort of thing, and I'm not sure where, in my personal view, where the prison system comes in sort of. I guess it's a form of punishment, but I think the eye for an eye sort of conversation comes more into the fact when Alex gets released from prison, encounters the old homeless man that he beat up, and he then gets that same treatment from him, or when he runs into his old droogs and gang mates, and then they beat him up the same way that he treated them. And also the eye for an eye with F. Alexander, which I think is where it more comes through, is like he sort of gets those same treatments or punishments.
That is like a view of basically, I suppose, taking the victims and saying that what victims want is for the person who harmed them to suffer the same way. Exactly. Which of course is, and I wrote about the death penalty in this last newsletter that we did, but it's one of the sort of arguments for the death penalty, deprive of life somebody who has taken life or whatever for in situations of murder. But I suppose it's I don't think it's necessarily the most common or helpful view of what prisons are for. I mean, you're right in a way that I think, because the prison system doesn't seem so bad necessarily. I mean, it's not pleasant, but it's not awful for what is it, apart from not having his liberty.
Yes.
And having to spend all his time with criminals, which he obviously doesn't like. Alex doesn't necessarily have that bad a time of it, and partly is because he seems to manipulate the system and makes them think that he's converted to some sort of righteous Christianity because he's reading the Bible all the time, when actually he's picturing himself as the violent Old Testament characters, or dressed in high Roman fashion, being the one to flagellate Jesus.
So funny.
Yeah, it is really
funny. And then exactly. I mean, because it is from his perspective, you still get those fantasies even when he sort of claims he's. So it was brilliant. That was actually really funny imagery. But I mean, so I think also what I wanted to discuss while on the topic of the ideas of like freedoms and stuff is because I feel like there's two different types of like freedom that he like suffers, the sort of taking away of is if he's in prison, he suffers the freedom of like not being able to move, or really those sort of all the sort of privileges that you lose from being in prison whilst having this Ludovico technique performed on him completely removes any sort of internal free will that he might have. Like, he's not physically restricted, but he's restricted by his own psychology at this point. So I don't really know, because they're both two different types of, I feel like, restricted freedoms.
Absolutely, I'm definitely with you on that. I mean, I think that I sort of trying to categorize different views of what punishment, whether it's prison or whether it's these kind of techniques. So what do we want to get out of the penal system? And one is obviously the sort of eye for an eye thing, although many people would perhaps argue, well, isn't that reducing the state and the state as representative of the people to the level of the criminal? There's an interview that I referenced in the newsletter from a lawyer and campaigner who particularly works with people on death row and works against campaigns against the death penalty. Basically, he says, if a murderer took their victim and basically held them for 35 years on the threat that they were going to kill them at any time, we would think of that as being absolutely heinous behaviour. But if the state does it to a prisoner on death row, we say that that's their right. So I feel that there's something, about not reducing the state to the same standards as people who commit criminal behaviour. But of course, there's other things. There's like, it keeps the community safe. If you remove people from the streets, and I think that for victims, this is a really important thing. And it's one of the issues at the moment with it taking so long for rape cases to get to court, for example, that, people are still, their rapist may still be in their environment and so on. So safety of the community seems to be important, but also reform. I mean, reform seems to me to be the single most important thing that we don't necessarily do very well. But basically, when people come out of prison, they'll be in a position where they're less likely to commit crimes than when they went into prison. And prison is not necessarily, I would say, I think, the best environment for doing that. But of course, that's what Burgess is taking and satirising, isn't it? This idea, we'll reform people not through actually getting them to think differently. The chaplain's busy trying to do it by telling them they're going to burn in hell unless they live better lives. Not necessarily very effective either. But it brings us on to the Ludovico technique as something that essentially tries to achieve that, reducing pressure on the prisons, because in 2 weeks you can turn people around and make them good. And there's a quotation of the bit where the minister basically presents to his audience Alex as a kind of experiment guinea pig. And he says, what a change is here, ladies and gentlemen, from the wretched hoodlum the state committed to unprofitable punishment some 2 years ago, unchanged after 2 years. Unchanged, do I say? Not quite. Prison taught him a false smile, the rubbed hands of hypocrisy, the fawning, greased, obsequious leer. Other vices prison taught him, as well as confirming in him those he had long practiced before. Another issue with prisons, obviously. Our party promised to restore law and order and to make the streets safe for the ordinary peace-loving citizen. This pledge is now about to become a reality. The problem of criminal violence is soon to be a thing of the past, but enough of words. And then he goes on to sort of, demonstrate this. But that raises another question, which is to what extent is the penal system about politicians being seen to do something about a problem that they're not necessarily tackling. One of the things that I think the minister says, which again is supposed to hint at this kind of authoritarian government issue, is that they need to be able to put political prisoners into prison. So they need space for presumably all of their opponents where they're currently keeping people like Alex. But yeah, okay, right. So Ludovico technique and kind of what it does in terms of free will, because you're absolutely right. This is one of the big issues. And the governor didn't like it because it was too easy on prisoners. Yeah. And then the minister didn't like it because he thinks that it removes choice and doesn't actually create goodness, because if you can't do bad, you cannot choose good. And F. Alexander and his buddies, they don't like it because it is part of the apparatus of totalitarianism, and it turns him into a Clockwork Orange, where the name of the book comes from, like a little turning toy that has none of the good properties of an actual orange. So these are all things that we could say about this. But I don't know, I mean, what were your thoughts? I mean, there's a sort of scientific element here, I suppose, as well as a philosophical element.
Yeah, I mean, so the film, the stories must be a critique on, I think, this book by B.F. Skinner, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, which sort of argues that it argues on lines of that the technology of human behavior can basically be used to promote further the progression of human society, and sort of Skinner calls it like cultural engineering, which I think I might read a bit more on, it maybe potential thing to write in the newsletter about.
Yeah, that'd be useful.
Tune in for future editions. Yeah, Burgess called it one of the most dangerous books ever written. But yeah, so it basically takes the techniques of operant conditioning, like a reward and punishment sort of system, to condition Alex to have this internal nausea arise whenever he has visual cues of sex or violence, which is even sort of, as we were talking about when we were talking about sex a bit before, completely even stops him from having any sex whatsoever, whether it's positive or negative, which could be like possibly part of like even sort of some sort of like eugenics based sort of
that's a very good point, isn't it? It does link ideas like chemical castration, but it's sort of psychological castration, isn't it?
And especially with the themes of this sort of integrated evil that you're sort of born with this, because it like Alex's character, it's not really been shown to be a product of something. I mean, maybe potentially a product of the society that he grows up in general, but
although not everybody is turned into Alex.
That's exactly that's true.
There's obviously widespread sort of psychopathic youth. This is not a unique problem, but it's obviously he is still a sort of outstanding character in his field of ultraviolent behavior. So
and with that, the interesting thing that there's a bit of a twist within this experiment is that with his love of classical music, Alex actually develops a classical conditioning behavior with the sound of hearing Beethoven's Ninth, I think.
Yes,
that he gets the same reaction, which I think is used as again, in a sort of satirical sense, as a form of punishment for him.
Yeah, it's an interesting one insofar as I think that it feels obviously like, quite an extreme example of this sort of thing. I noticed that I wrote in newsletter 1 about The Last Ship, and one of the seasons of The Last Ship includes a megalomaniacal doctor who is basically trying, whilst curing a disease that is spread through crops worldwide, he has a way of basically genetically engineering, I suppose, against the crop virus. But he takes this as an opportunity to also introduce something into the world's food population that will essentially prevent violent acts. That's the idea. So it's a very similar idea in a way, except instead of psychologically programming somebody, it's basically saying that these people would still desire to do it, but can't do it. And there too, it's treated as something that is wrong, is bad. This idea of basically trying to sort of, without any free will, remove people's ability to do violence because he thinks it will make the world a better place as a consequence. So yeah, I suppose what is the question here is really, why is it that, apart from the fact that, as we say, it conditions get music as a side effect, it has this effect that he can't even have kind of good sexual relationships, he can't defend himself.
No.
Potential issue. But if we just took it as a basic sort of premise of stopping him from doing the things that he was doing nightly, involving rape and theft and beatings and murder, why is it so bad? Why shouldn't the state do this to remove his from society?
Well, I think there's that same element of I think you said before about if he is unable to do bad, there is no choice to do good, as well as just general elements of probably consent around the fact that if I think there's a huge thing in science about informed consent, about what sort of procedures that you might go through, especially if you're participating in certain research studies and stuff, which is an issue here where I think it is not explained to Alex. I mean, he's not even given the opportunity to.
Don't read it. Just sign.
Just sign.
It's another one of those scenes that I get. There's so much sort of humor in the film that I think is unique to the sort of visual effects of it all. But the way in which he has to stay behind the line, but then he's supposed to sign for things on the desk, and he has to do that massive stretch forward.
Yes.
Of course, he can't read the document because he's at arm's length from it, and so he just, and they're not even clear with him to start with. You're just saying, watch some videos. So yes, you're right. I think that there's a real question there again, and some people probably say, well, one of the maybe one of the rights he loses in prison is the the right to specify kind of that they can't do certain remedial things to him, but
that's a human
it's a human right, exactly. And this is the thing, and I think a lot of this comes down to this idea about human rights for me, which of course again, big debate at the moment. Lots of people say, oh, human rights terribly woke or whatever, and
terribly woke.
Yeah.
What have we come to?
But I mean, I think I'm one of these people who thinks that prisoners should have the vote. I feel quite strongly that there are certain things that the state doesn't have the right to take away, including their say in the state, as it were, what the state can do, which is only in this country basically through the ballot box. So that's what I think. I think that should be part of prison reform. But obviously, there's a real thing here that's basically saying, oh, it's like a parody of prison reform, isn't it? By saying we can just get people out in 2 weeks. But I think, I'm quite sold on the sort of philosophical idea that, it's very hard to sort of commend a practice that essentially doesn't do anything to change a person's character or decision making or anything like that. It merely causes them this terrible sickness and pain. And I think it's this paralysis, feeling like you're going to die or something like that. It's really, really vicious response. But I think, is there supposed to be a view that some people just can't be changed, can't learn, and so on? So I don't know. There's because there's no, certainly in the film, there's no clear sort of right answer. Once he gets cured of the cure, we're back at square one, really, in the film in terms of his behavior. So I don't think either of those is supposed to have been a good thing, either subjecting him to the method or undoing the damage. And it also made me think about this term cruel and unusual punishment, which is, I think, in the I don't know where, if at all, because we have a constitution in this country where it comes in, but I know in the United States that's the wording of the constitution, that they're not allowed to inflict cruel or unusual punishment onto people. And that's where, questions about what sort of things you can do when you're executing somebody and so on. But this struck me as actually, from the outside of thinking the outcomes, which is all the minister seems to care about, the outcome of removing the danger that Alex poses is enough, but the process for getting there seems to be completely overlooked, and like no one quite seems to know what happens behind those closed doors. You mentioned music, and I think that is so important for both the book and the film. We talked there about Beethoven's Ninth. I thought that one of the things, going back to the film, that is just so powerful about it is the way in which kind of like music and almost like dance effectively is incorporated into the violence. What did you think that added, I suppose, the way in which, so the fight scene with the other gang, for example, is a really strong example of that. The setting of that is specific to the film as well. It's just a warehouse, I think, in the book, but in the film it's turned into like a stage, like a cabaret sort of scene. So clearly trying to make it very performative. And also in the bit where F. Alexander is being beaten up, and prior to the rape of his wife, there's the Singing in the Rain dance, of course, as well.
There's a sort of, I guess it all kind of plays up to sort of satire, but like almost like slapstick comedy-esque, like kind of effect. I mean, I think a lot of the soundtrack actually contains a lot of like music by Rossini, especially with the like fast motion sex scene and the slow motion fight between the two gangs, and also with the invasion of the cat lady's home. I think also sort of all draws those like scenes of violence and sex together. But I mean, I think we're talking about how it's almost kind of choreographed. I mean, I think pairing it with classical music, which I think has like this association of like a high society properness. I mean, it's almost like a kind of delicacy. I think that might be like part of Alex's fantasy of like indulging in these sort of novel acts. I don't know, maybe
it's a bit at the very end when he gets given when he's back in hospital and he's been given a stereo and the Ninth is played, then he describes it in a way that I think is really powerful. So it's, then brothers it came, oh bliss, bliss and heaven, oh it was gorgeousness and gorgeosity made flesh. The trombones crunched red gold under my bed, and behind my Gulliver the trumpets three wise silver flamed, and there by the door the timps rolling through my guts and out again crunched like candy thunder. It was like a bird of rarest spun heaven metal, or like silvery wine flowing in a spaceship, gravity all nonsense now. As I slooshied, I knew such lovely pictures. There were Veeks and Ptitzers lying on the ground screaming for mercy, and I was smecking all over my rot and grinding my boots into their tortured litzos, and there were naked debauchkas ripped and creaching against walls, and I plunged like a schlager into them. So that's one of the voiceovers of one of the bits where he's listening to Beethoven. And in the film, of course, we get, the playing out, as we've said, of sort of seeds of violence in his own head, influenced by different triggers as well. So we can sort of picture these things that he is describing. And I find it interesting. I think there's two things. One is to pick up on your idea about kind of high culture being used in sort of low violence. And I think that one of the things that perhaps Burgess, and then by extension Kubrick in the film, is trying to do is basically say, all of this talk about how if we get young people to appreciate the arts and listen to stuff that isn't I don't know, like ultraviolent rap or whatever, they'll not have these aggressive,
aggressive
tendencies. Whereas it's exactly, the music that brings out these images. And of course, I think the same kind of parody is being done with the Bible. It's like, oh, read your Bible and you won't feel obviously anybody who knows their Old Testament well will know that it's full of truly horrible things. So, apart from the New Testament and scenes of crucifixion and so on, but the Old Testament and the violence there, and incense and rape and polygamy and all sorts of things that perhaps are not going to inspire people in quite the way that the simple-minded sort of, oh, read your Bible and all will be well language implies. So I think there's something there. But then there's a flip side, which is in the film, I couldn't decide whether by pairing music so Rossini's interesting because obviously opera, again, full of violence and death and things like that, depending which operas you're watching. But, if you we're talking about Rossini, whatever, lots of classical music from the era of Beethoven being written with battle imagery in mind or whatever. So there's a definite link there, but there's also something about the violence almost being lessened for the viewer when it's choreographed into either the slow motion or turned into a dance effectively on the screen. I don't know. Do you think it reduces the impact of it for the viewer?
Oh yeah, because it feels less organic. You could even say it is almost like not even a censoring, but sort of. Yeah, I think the impact is sort of less shocking just because, it feels like less real and more staged. So I do agree. I think that sort of element does sort of make it less,
it reminded me of, I don't know, because I don't particularly enjoy ultra-violent films. Generally, for instance, ultra-violence are very Alex, isn't I don't really enjoy violent films or films where violence feels gratuitous anyway.
Yes.
And yet A Clockwork Orange doesn't ever feel like that in my head. And it reminded me of, did you ever see the film Sin City?
I haven't, no.
So one of the things about Sin City was that the aesthetic is built on the graphic novel that it comes from. And the aesthetic is so beautiful that it somehow makes it again less, because it's less real and because it's sort of moved into this particular visual world. The fact that it's highly violent doesn't seem to have the same impact for me as a viewer. And I wonder whether this said something about, well, almost like we were seeing through Alex's eyes in a way, that he sees violence as something beautiful and akin to listening to Beethoven's Ninth, and therefore we're actually kind of moving into his world way of seeing things, which when you start thinking about it like that, it's actually massively uncomfortable because we're not having the sort of vehement reaction that we should have. And likewise, when he's cutting off Mrs. Alexander's red jumpsuit, when and again there's something almost like has the potential to be humorous, like when he cuts the like nipples off the dress off the top. And the very fact that that's juxtaposed with a scene of extreme violence could either be seen as incredibly clever or or incredibly problematic. So we have talked about quite a lot of the things that I feel this lends us. There's so much we could talk about. Shall we finish by talking about the end?
Yes.
So for those who are familiar with the film, which I expect is most people, it's worth knowing that the film is based on the American edition of the book, and Burgess has written about this. The American edition of the book was 20 chapters long instead of 21 chapters long because the final chapter was omitted. And the film therefore ends at the same point as that edition does, but Burgess's original British edition ends with a further chapter, at the end of which he's got a new gang. He's basically hanging out in the same places, living the same kind of life, and he sort of expresses essentially getting bored of it, and then he starts imagining having a child and how he would talk to that child about kind of understanding the things that he had done and so on. And he essentially concludes it with he needed to go and finding some Dvochka or other who would be a mother to this son. I would have to start on that tomorrow, I kept thinking. That was something like new to do. That was something I would have to get started on. A new chapter beginning. That's what it's going to be then, brothers, as I come to the end of this tale. You have been everywhere with your little droog Alex, suffering with him, and you vidied some of the most grasny brachnies old bog ever made, all onto your old droog Alex. And all it was that I was young. But now I end this story, brothers. I am not young. No, no longer. Oh no. Alex like groweth up. Oh yes. So a potential future for this new grown-up Alex at age of, I don't know, probably your age, Masha. He's now like, oh, I think I have a child, and you know, not necessarily because he thinks that he could like make another child better. He actually thinks that a child would probably just behave in exactly the same way, because he thinks that every generation is going to behave the same way. But the film doesn't do that. So what did you think about the end of the film? And do you think we need the extra chapter?
I mean, I don't think it changes necessarily the meaning or the sort of commentary of the story. I think the final chapter really kind of, it sort of hints towards this express for a more conventional life, and you know, whether Alex's sort of rehabilitation is it really of his own free will, or just like a product of the conditioning that he had like undergone. Yeah, I think with the film, I think it's a good place to leave off, because I think it focuses on like it still focuses, it sort of leaves the audience pondering how the state sort of dealt with the sort of fallout with this like experimental conditioning, and how Alex at the end of the day was just another pawn in the state's overall sort of game. So I think the final chapter, I think, takes away from that final conclusion, especially with the way that both F. Alexander used him for his political gains, and then the government used him as, you know, used their power to sort of gain him as damage control on what was going on with their political agenda.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's, you know, that I think is a really important observation, actually, that yes, the film, yes, it ends it like personal on Alex insofar as you know, he says, oh yes, I was cured, whatever. He was just back to his old ways. But you're right that it focuses in on that scene of, you know, him sitting, like having this photo taken with the minister and so on, having, you know, covered in the bandages that were caused by the fact that F. Alexander first tried to manipulate him into kind of being an anti-government token, and that I think is again even given even more space in the book. And then the fact that F. Alexander basically becomes, you know, I think again making some sort of point that victims want to inflict terrible things upon the predators that have harmed them, and therefore that scene of the playing of the Beethoven through the floor and F. Alexander looking madder and madder, as I said, it does rather remove any sense of, you know, sympathy for him as a victim somehow for the viewer, which is perhaps a problem as well. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely you know, I think that this idea that the state is now going to use Alex for a new purpose, which is essentially that they're worried about losing the next election, but, you know, Alex can basically speak in certain ways that will alleviate this problem. So yes, I think that it does focus in on that basically, you know, he's another pawn of the state, and I think that comes through very strongly in the film. And I wonder whether for the book, because Burgess is, you know, highly critical of the state in general, describes himself as an anarchist, perhaps he wanted to move the narrative away from that of the state and back into that of the individual, although it's still like Alex within a system where he suddenly thinks, you know, having a child would be a good idea. It's, you know, again sort of alluding to this idea that this is something cyclical, generational violence, even though obviously his parents seem to have, you know, pretty weird and boring, but they really want Joe. They don't really want Alex as their son. But I think that the thing that I have a real problem with that ending in the book is this thing that's come up quite a lot, which is basically, oh, people who are young behave badly and they grow out of it, and, you know, yeah, they maybe kill people, but yeah, they could become decent members of society. It's great on the narrative of rehabilitation, not so good on how you view young people and how society views young people.
Yeah.
You're an actual young person. Do you have any thoughts about the way in which society has a view about its younger generations? Like, how do older generations view younger generations?
I mean, I think especially what I've observed most recently is how the older generation treats sort of the Gen Z work ethic, and I think as there's reaching as far as I've been politically aware in my years, I feel like we're reaching the sort of stage of like this overworking and hyper sort of productivity, and like I feel like as though my generation is starting to reject that notion as that is the only way to sort of go out and live, especially with how it's more like harder and harder to get, to even buy property or be able to afford that. This sort of notion of work hard and you can achieve one thing or another just does not seem tangible anymore. But then
and I think alongside that is this idea that somehow I know we talked before, I think, about like quiet quitting, and the idea of that it's somehow seen as not doing your job if you literally do your job, and there's a big
if you literally do the equivalent of what you're getting paid for, and not it's I don't know, I think hugely, and the fact that sort of the whole entire quiet quitting and sort of rejection of like overtime and going above and beyond is just why would you? So I don't know. Yeah, I think there's definitely sort of an idea of like laziness around the youth. Yes, but I think that's every generation.
Well, that's another point, isn't it? Does every generation look on the generation below them and think, young people these days?
Yes, yes.
I don't know. I mean, I think that it's a very interesting sort of, we take, Clockwork Orange is sort of an extreme version of that, sort of saying, every generation has its sort of problems, but they'll probably grow up to be all right once they grow out of this or whatever. But I think that is something that the film perhaps rather less does, because Alex, I think, feels a lot more unique. Cool. Okay, right. So what is the takeaway message of this film?
Well, I think there's a number of sort of takeaway messages, but I think the main one is about free will and choice, and especially around how to rehabilitate people who've committed crimes, especially with a focus on how someone who might have broken the law still should have their human rights, respected, and maybe sort of ideas of how someone might be redeemed back into society, and how after someone's committed a crime they can move forward from then on.
I would be with you. I think that is something that I would definitely want to take away from this, even though, as I say, it's not clearly sort of like, it's not evidently moralizing in its way, so we're not left with it's more like, how do you sort of feel after you've been confronted with this, rather than what it's kind of told us and I think going back to where we started, I think it's left me really thinking about, okay, so as somebody who believes that societal situations and circumstance play a great deal into criminal behavior, and if we were to say yes, but what if that's more complex than we think? What if it's actually also about the way in which a young person, particularly perhaps, might be influenced by what appear to be cultural norms around them, but which are kind of consumed in an unfiltered or an immature way? So what happens when you go back to our point about pornographic imagery? What happens when that is consumed? What does it do to people's attitude to violence? What happens when perhaps there's something here about the listlessness, the purposelessness of young people in a generation? What happens when that happens to you? Fits quite nicely with what you were saying about Gen Z. So there's definitely something here about looking at an overall society and saying, what are we doing to each generation that might affect their behavior in certain ways, and what can or should a state's response be to that? Awesome. Cool. Okay,
thank you very much for listening to our 11th episodes, focusing on A Clockwork Orange. I know. So please tune in for our next one, Leave the World Behind, which I think will be released on the 18th of February.
Sounds plausible. It's on Netflix. It's a film on Netflix with Julia Roberts in it.
I'm very excited to watch it, actually. I haven't got around to it, but I'm very excited to dissect it. And also, please consider supporting us as we do this voluntarily, but with our own lives. It was great to see support from our listeners. I think there's what's the support?
So best place to look is to follow us on Instagram, at Dystopian Current Affairs, then go to links in bio, where you can do all sorts of lovely things, like find our coffee link, find our Substack link.
Yes.
And obviously you can find the link to the podcast, which you can then share widely with your friends and family. And if you rate and review us on whatever pod platform you use, that's also good support.
Yes, and finally, don't forget to read our next newsletter, which is released on the 11th of February.
Never a week goes by in people's lives when they don't have some exciting contribution from us into their lives.
Exactly. So please tune in for all these new things.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Masha.